The early years of the Cold War. In this video, we will explore the Cold War in the 1950s and early 1960s, with the topics such as the Korean War, the Second Red Scare, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the Berlin Wall. Containment around the world. For many, the containment policy had been largely successful in Europe, but soon the United States realized that other countries were also vulnerable. After World War II, many former colonies became independent and had to deal with widespread poverty and economic underdevelopment, as well as many other social and political problems. Communism seemed to offer a path to rapid industrialization and greater social equality. Red China. Since 1927, Chinese communist rebels were trying to overthrow the nationalist Chinese government. When Japan invaded China in 1937, both sides agreed to a truce and focused on fighting the Japanese invaders. The nationalist forces, led by Chiang Kai-shek, were weakened during World War II. In 1949, the communist forces, led by Mao Zedong, defeated the nationalists and took power. Under Mao, China, the most populous country in the world, became communist. Chiang Kai-shek retreated to the island of Taiwan, hoping to return one day to the mainland and defeat the communists. The United States supported Kai-shek and recognized him and the nationalists as the official government of China, refusing in turn to recognize Mao's Red China. Taiwan, or Nationalist China, even obtained a seat at the United Nations General Assembly and the Security Council. Americans were shocked that the United States had not done more to prevent China from falling into communism. The Korean War. Korea had been ruled by Japan since 1905. At the end of the war, the territory was divided along the 38th parallel and occupied by the two superpowers. The Soviets established an occupation zone in the north, while the Americans did the same in the south. Just like in Germany, a communist state was established in the north and a capitalist state in the south. In 1950, North Korea invaded the south in hopes of uniting the country under communist rule. Truman immediately decided to send troops to help South Korea. At the time, the Soviet Union was boycotting the UN Security Council since it had failed to seat communist China. The United States took that opportunity to pass a resolution condemning North Korea's aggression and urging member countries to assist South Korea. Only 5 years after World War II, Americans found themselves in another major war. General Douglas MacArthur was placed in command of the operation. MacArthur landed his forces in Incheon Beach, surprising the North Korean forces, which were forced to retreat. The American forces continued their advance up to the Yalu River in the North Korean border with China. At that point, Chinese forces entered the conflict and forced MacArthur to retreat to the 38th parallel. MacArthur wanted to blockade China and assist Kai-shek to retake power using the atomic bomb if necessary. Truman disagreed. MacArthur publicly criticized the president on his refusal to follow his plans, and Truman removed him from command. In 1952, Dwight Eisenhower, who had been the Allied commander on D-Day, was elected president, with a promise to end the Korean War. An armistice was signed in 1953. At PANMUNJOM, a village sitting on a demilitarized zone, or DMZ. To this day, Korea remains divided along the 38th parallel. In the north, we have an isolated communist dictatorship, and in the south, a prosperous industrial economy. There is a 2.5-mile strip of demilitarized zone between the two countries, where rare wildlife has thrived. The Second Red Scare. With the rapid spread of communism in Europe and Asia, Truman made it clear that he wanted to fight communism at home as well as abroad. To face a possible communist threat at home, Truman created the Loyalty Review Boards, which were in charge of investigating government employees for un-American activities, such as belonging to the Communist Party. Congress also conducted its own investigations in the House Committee on Un-American Activities. Actors, directors, writers, government officials, union leaders, and other individuals were interrogated about their political beliefs and activities, as well as those of coworkers, friends, and family. People who had communist ties or refused to answer the committee questions were often blacklisted, fired from their jobs, and unable to find any work after. Such was the case of the Hollywood 10, 10 prominent writers and directors who refused to answer questions and later were fired from their jobs and not hired again for more than a decade. With the fall of China and the development of a Soviet atomic bomb, the anti-communist hysteria increased as people wondered whether they had been negligent in the foreign policy in Chinese affairs, or if any government official had sold nuclear secrets to the Soviets. In 1948, ALGER, a prominent official in the State Department, was accused of spying for the Soviets. The FBI also began collecting information on communist sympathizers. In 1950, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were tried and executed on charges of furnishing atomic secrets to the Soviets, becoming the first Americans executed under such charges. McCarthyism. The anti-communist paranoia reached its height in the early 1950s, when U.S. Senator Joseph McCarthy announced that he had a list of communist spies who had infiltrated the U.S. State Department. Despite the lack of evidence to back his claims, McCarthy was put in charge of his own congressional committee and continued to hold hearings, accusing other agencies as well. In 1953, McCarthy lost his influence and popularity when he accused Army officials of disloyalty and went on television to make his case. The American public witnessed on TV his bullying tactics and exaggerated claims that had destroyed so many careers. The term McCarthyism refers not only to the anti-communist hysteria of the 1950s, but also to the practice of making unsound accusations against innocent people. Nuclear proliferation. In 1949, the Soviet Union successfully tested its first atomic bomb. Within a few years, both superpowers had also developed hydrogen bombs, or H-bombs, which have the potential to be 1,000 times more powerful than the atomic bomb. Each country believed that nuclear arsenal served as a deterrent against attacks. Nuclear weapons were extremely dangerous, and soon military leaders realized that they could not be used in most scenarios, since they threatened the survival of humanity. A nuclear attack by either superpower would have been countered with massive retaliation from the other. Despite all of this, both countries entered an arms race like no other, building and stockpiling nuclear weapons to ensure their nuclear superiority. Containment under Eisenhower. During the Eisenhower presidency, the United States extended aid to France in its fight with Vietnamese nationalists who wanted independence under a communist government. The Central Intelligence Agency, or CIA, was involved in training exiles, who succeeded in overthrowing the leftist government in Guatemala. Additionally, the United States pledged to protect the island of Taiwan and its nationalist government from any attacks from the communist mainland. In 1956, Soviet troops invaded Hungary to put down an anti-communist protest. The US could not intervene, but Eisenhower promptly condemned the Soviet actions. President Eisenhower took a special interest in the Middle East, and under the Eisenhower Doctrine, he extended his containment policy to this region. In 1956, he had already supported Egypt in the Suez Canal crisis, and in 1958, the US sent troops to Lebanon to support its pro-Western president against the threats of revolution. Sputnik and the space race. In 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik, the first man-made satellite into space, catching the United States by surprise. Congress could not believe that the Soviet Union was so ahead and immediately funded math and science education programs to catch up. This event marked the beginning of the space race, with its military implications. Rocket technology allowed the Soviets to travel into space, but also to fire missiles that could carry nuclear warheads to the United States. In 1958, NASA was formed, and the area around Cape Canaveral in Florida became an important center of operations, from which all American rockets were launched into space. In 1961, Yuri Gagarin from the Soviet Union became the first man to orbit the Earth, and only 8 years later, the United States space program succeeded in its first manned moon landing. Nikita Khrushchev. Joseph Stalin died in 1953. Nikita Khrushchev became the new Soviet leader. Although he was less extreme than Stalin, Khrushchev believed in the superiority of communism and the decadence of the West. He visited the United States in 1959 and confirmed plans for a Soviet-American conference the following year. The conference, however, was cancelled after American U-2 spy plane flown by Gary Powers was shot down over Soviet territory. Cuba. In 1959, Fidel Castro and his guerrilla fighters overthrew Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista. Castro, who had promised to establish a democracy in Cuba, ended up establishing a communist dictatorship instead. Castro nationalized private property in Cuba, affecting American interests. Eisenhower responded by cutting off trade and diplomatic relations with the island nation. Eisenhower supported CIA training of Cuban exiles to topple Castro. As the Eisenhower presidency was coming to a close, Cuban exiles were still training in Guatemala and South Florida. Eisenhower's vice president, Richard Nixon, lost the presidential election to the Democratic candidate John F. Kennedy in 1960. From 1959 to 1962, a first wave of Cuban refugees, many of them professionals or business owners, came to the United States, most of them settling in the Miami area. The influx of Cuban refugees continued despite restrictions on air travel in the early 1960s. In 1980, Castro announced that anyone who wanted to leave Cuba could do so from the port of Mariel. The result was an exodus of more than 100,000 Marielitos. To this day, Miami is considered the center of Cuban American life and culture. Kennedy and containment in Latin America. John F. Kennedy became president in 1961, and his biggest concern was the presence of communism in Cuba. Kennedy feared that communism might spread from Cuba to other countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. In April 1961, a few months after Kennedy's inauguration, CIA-trained Cuban exiles attempted to invade Cuba and topple the Castro regime. The operation, known as the Bay of Pigs invasion, was a complete failure. The invading forces did not receive air cover or further military support and were soon defeated and captured. In his first year as president, Kennedy launched the Alliance for Progress, an ambitious program offering loans and grants to Latin American countries and promoting economic progress, trade, and land reform. The program was generally unsuccessful, since local elites in Latin America were reluctant to make reforms. Along with the Alliance for Progress, Kennedy created the Green Beret to combat communism using guerrilla warfare techniques, and the Peace Corps, in which young American volunteers provided economic and social assistance to developing countries. These programs were implemented not only in Latin America, but also in Asia and Africa. The Cuban Missile Crisis. After the Bay of Pigs invasion, Castro strengthened his ties to the Soviet Union. In October 1962, American spy planes discovered that Soviet nuclear missiles were about to be installed in Cuban bases. These missiles would have given the Soviets a wide range of targets in the United States. This discovery led to the Cuban Missile Crisis, the closest the world has come to a nuclear war. Kennedy faced a tough situation. He needed to prevent missiles from being deployed in Cuba without causing a nuclear war. Kennedy decided to blockade Cuba, threatening to invade if the missiles were not withdrawn. Khrushchev agreed to withdraw the missiles if the United States pledged not to invade the island and withdrew the American missiles installed in Turkey. Even though Kennedy took the world close to a nuclear war, the outcome of the crisis was a big success for U.S. foreign policy. American and Soviet leaders set up a hotline, a telephone connection for communication in times of crisis, and negotiated a ban on all nuclear tests, unless they were done underground. The Berlin Wall. In 1961, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev ordered the construction of the Berlin Wall, a concrete wall with barbed wire, guarded by machine gun towers, to separate East Berlin from West Berlin. The purpose of the structure was to prevent East Germans from escaping to the West through Berlin. In 1963, Kennedy visited Berlin and pronounced his famous words, "Ich bin ein Berliner." I am a Berliner. Kennedy intended to convey a message of support and make clear that US would not abandon West Berlin. This is the last video of this unit. We will continue with the Cold War in later units. Thank you for watching. Please click like and subscribe for more videos.